Close your eyes. Get comfortable. Let me tell you a bedtime story that will make you incredibly grateful for your warm bed, your smartphone, even your Monday morning alarm clock. Tonight, we're taking a journey through time. I want you to imagine something truly wild. Picture yourself going to sleep right now in your cozy room. But when you wake up, you're not in 2024 anymore. You've somehow been transported back to the year 536 AD. And let me tell you right off the bat, you've just woken up in what scientists officially consider the absolute worst year in human history. Not 2020 with its pandemic, not 1348 with the Black Death, not even 1177 BC when civilization collapsed. Nope. 536 AD takes the crown as the most miserable, terrifying, and downright bizarre year to be alive on planet Earth. Now you might be thinking, come on, how bad could it really be? Well, imagine waking up and the sun has literally disappeared. Not an eclipse, not cloudy weather, but the sun has been blocked out for months, creating an endless twilight that makes everything look like a horror movie. The temperature has dropped so dramatically that it's snowing in July. Crops are dying worldwide. People are starving. And that's just the beginning of this historical nightmare. You see, 536 wasn't just bad because of one thing. It was like the universe decided to throw every possible disaster at humanity all at once, as if someone was playing a cosmic game of what's the worst that could happen, and kept rolling snake eyes. We're talking about volcanic eruptions so massive they changed the global climate, plagues that would make modern pandemics look like a mild cold, famines so severe that people resorted to cannibalism, wars breaking out everywhere as societies collapsed, and natural phenomena so strange that people genuinely believed the world was ending. The craziest part? Most people living through it had no idea what was causing these disasters. They didn't have scientists or meteorologists. They didn't have the internet to explain that a massive volcanic eruption in Indonesia had thrown so much ash into the atmosphere that it blocked out the sun across the entire northern hemisphere. All they knew was that their world had suddenly turned into a living hell, and their medieval explanations for what was happening were often more terrifying than the reality. Picture trying to explain to someone in 536 AD that the reason the sun disappeared wasn't because God was angry or because the devil was taking over, but because a mountain on the other side of the world exploded so violently that it changed the weather everywhere. They'd probably think you were completely insane. So as you drift off to sleep tonight in your climate-controlled room with your refrigerator full of food, and your weather app telling you exactly what to expect tomorrow, remember that you're living in absolute luxury compared to our ancestors, who had to survive the year when everything went wrong at once. This is the story of 536 AD, the year that almost ended human civilization, told through the eyes of ordinary people who had no idea they were living through the worst year in history, and somehow, against all odds, managed to survive and pass down the most incredible tales of human endurance you've ever heard. Trust me, by the end of this story, you'll never complain about a bad day again, because whatever you're going through, at least the sun is still shining. The plague isn't at your door, and you're not wondering if the world is literally ending. Unlike our poor ancestors in 536 who woke up each day not knowing if they'd see another sunset, assuming they could even see the sun at all. Now, to truly understand why 536 was such a catastrophe, you need to picture what the world was like before everything went to hell. Imagine Europe in the early 500s. The mighty Roman Empire that had ruled for over 1,000 years had crumbled just decades earlier. The year 476 AD marked the official end of the Western Roman Empire. And honestly, things were already pretty rough. You got barbarian tribes running around, claiming chunks of former Roman territory like it's some kind of medieval real estate grab. The Visigoths had Spain. The Vandals controlled North Africa. The Ostrogoths were running Italy, and everyone was basically making it up as they went along. There was no Google Maps to navigate this political chaos, no CNN to tell you which kingdom was at war with which tribe this week. Communication between regions took months. If you lived in a small village, you might not even know who your actual ruler was supposed to be. The infrastructure that Rome had built, those famous roads, aqueducts, and administrative systems, they were crumbling faster than a cookie in milk. Trade routes that had connected the known world for centuries were now dangerous bandit highways. Cities that once housed hundreds of thousands of people were shrinking into ghost towns. People were abandoning urban life and retreating to countryside villages, hoping that being isolated might actually be safer. Meanwhile, in the east, the Byzantine Empire was trying to hold things together. Emperor Justinian had just come to power in 527 AD, and this guy had some seriously ambitious plans. He wanted to reconquer the entire Mediterranean, restore the glory of Rome, build the most magnificent buildings the world had ever seen. Basically, he was the ancient equivalent of a CEO with unrealistic quarterly targets. But here's the thing about Justinian. The man was absolutely obsessed with proving that the Roman Empire wasn't really dead. He was spending massive amounts of money on military campaigns, hiring expensive mercenaries, building projects that would make modern governments cry about budget deficits. And while he was busy playing empire builder, regular people were dealing with the fact that life had become incredibly unpredictable and dangerous. Medical knowledge was basically non-existent. If you got sick, your treatment options were prayer, herbs that may or may not poison you, and hoping that bloodletting would somehow balance your bodily humors. The average person lived to maybe 30 if they were incredibly lucky. Child mortality was so high that families didn't even name their babies until they survived their first winter. Food security was a constant worry. A bad harvest meant starvation. A good harvest meant you might actually survive until the next planting season. There were no emergency food supplies, no government assistance programs, no international aid. If your crops failed, you died. Period. And the social structure was basically feudalism in its early, chaotic form. You had a tiny elite of nobles and church officials living in relative luxury, then you had everyone else. Peasants, farmers, craftsmen, and merchants, all struggling to survive in a world where violence was routine and justice was whatever the local strongman decided it was. Christianity was spreading rapidly, but it wasn't the organized, institutional Christianity you might know today. It was wild, mystical, and full of competing interpretations. People were seeing signs and miracles everywhere, expecting the end times at any moment, which, considering what was about to happen in 536, turned out to be pretty accurate. The climate had been relatively stable for the past few centuries. People had developed agricultural practices based on predictable seasons, predictable weather patterns, predictable everything, really. They had absolutely no idea that the Earth's climate could change dramatically, seemingly overnight. No concept that events on the other side of the planet could affect their daily lives. So when our story really begins, humanity is already hanging on by a thread. Civilization is fragile. People are superstitious and scared. Governments are unstable. And everyone is just trying to survive in a world that's already pretty hostile. What they don't know is that they're about to face challenges that would make their current problems look like a minor inconvenience. Because in 536, everything they thought they knew about the world was about to change forever. Let's talk about what daily life was actually like in this bizarre pre-catastrophe world. Because honestly, even before 536 turned everything into a nightmare, people were living in ways that would absolutely blow your mind. Picture waking up in a medieval village. There's no running water, no electricity, no bathrooms as we know them. Your toilet is literally a hole in the ground. Or if you're fancy, a wooden seat over a hole in the ground. Privacy. What's that? Everyone knows everyone's business because you're all crammed together in tiny spaces sharing walls thinner than modern cardboard. Personal hygiene was, let's call it optional. Most people bathed maybe once a month if they were being extra clean. The wealthy might bathe once a week, which made them practically germaphobes by medieval standards. Deodorant didn't exist. Perfume was for the ultra-rich, so everyone just smelled like a combination of sweat, smoke, and whatever they'd been doing that day, which was usually something involving farm animals. The medical practices of this era were absolutely insane. Doctors genuinely believed that illness was caused by an imbalance of four bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Too much blood? Time for bloodletting. Feeling sad? Clearly you have too much black bile. The solution? More bloodletting. Headache? Definitely bloodletting. Broken leg? You guessed it, bloodletting. They also thought that looking at certain things could make you sick. Pregnant women were warned not to look at ugly people because it might make their babies ugly. People believed that eating walnuts would help brain problems because walnuts kind of look like brains. This was actual medical logic. If something looked like a body part, it must be medicine for that body part. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, without antiseptics, often without the surgeon even washing his hands. The survival rate was basically a coin flip, and that was for simple procedures. Complex surgeries? Forget about it. You were better off just accepting death. Food was incredibly monotonous and often dangerous. Peasants ate bread, porridge, and whatever vegetables they could grow. Meat was a luxury most people might taste a few times a year. And the bread? It was often made with grains that were slightly moldy or contaminated with ergot, a fungus that could cause hallucinations, convulsions, and death. So dinner might literally drive you insane. Preservation was a constant challenge. No refrigeration meant that meat had to be salted, smoked, or dried. Milk spoiled within hours unless you turned it into cheese. Fruits and vegetables had to be eaten immediately or preserved in ways that often made them nearly inedible by winter. Speaking of winter, heating was provided by wood fires that filled houses with smoke. Chimneys were still being perfected, so most homes were basically smoke boxes. People went to bed when the sun went down because candles were expensive. Wax candles were for the rich. Everyone else used tallow candles made from animal fat, which smelled terrible and barely provided any light. Entertainment was storytelling, drinking, and religious festivals that often got completely out of hand. People were desperate for any kind of distraction from their harsh lives. So festivals involved excessive drinking, questionable food, and activities that would probably be illegal today. Education was almost non-existent. Most people couldn't read or write. Numbers beyond basic counting were considered advanced mathematics. History was passed down through stories that got more exaggerated with each telling. Science was mostly wild guesses mixed with religious explanations. People genuinely believed that the earth was the center of the universe, that diseases were punishments from God, that weather was controlled by divine mood swings. If something bad happened, it was because someone had sinned. If something good happened, it was a miracle. There was no middle ground. Superstitions governed every aspect of daily life. Don't walk under ladders. Don't spill salt. Don't let black cats cross your path. Throw coins in wells for good luck. Carry rabbit feet for protection. Wear specific herbs to ward off evil spirits. And these weren't just fun traditions. People genuinely believed their survival depended on following these rules. Marriage was primarily a business transaction. Love was a nice bonus, but not required. Children were economic assets who could work and take care of you in old age, assuming they survived childhood, which was a big assumption. So this was the world in early 536. Already strange, already difficult, already unpredictable. But at least it was familiar strangeness. People had adapted to this bizarre way of life over generations. What they couldn't have prepared for was how much stranger and more difficult everything was about to become. So here we are, early 536 AD. People are going about their weird medieval lives, bleeding themselves for headaches, eating moldy bread, avoiding black cats. Everything is normal by 6th century standards. And then something happens that changes everything. But here's the crazy part. The thing that's about to destroy the world happens thousands of miles away from most people, in a place that Europeans don't even know exists. I'm talking about a massive volcano in Indonesia, specifically a mountain called Krakatoa, but not the famous 1883 eruption that you might have heard about. This is Krakatoa's big brother, the eruption that makes the 1883 event look like a firecracker. Scientists estimate that this 536 eruption was at least 10 times more powerful. We're talking about an explosion so massive that it literally changed the color of the sky and across the entire planet. Imagine the most powerful nuclear bomb ever created. Now multiply that by about 1,000. That's the kind of energy we're dealing with. The eruption sent approximately 4 cubic miles of rock, ash, and debris into the atmosphere. 4 cubic miles. That's enough material to bury the entire city of London under 30 feet of volcanic ash. But instead of staying local, this ash got launched into the stratosphere, where it spread around the globe like a deadly blanket. The immediate area around the volcano was obviously completely obliterated. Islands disappeared. Entire civilizations were wiped out in minutes. The sound of the explosion was heard over 3,000 miles away. The shockwaves circled the earth multiple times. Tsunamis over 100 feet tall crashed into coastlines across the Indian Ocean. But the real global catastrophe was just beginning. You see, when volcanic ash reaches the stratosphere, it doesn't come down quickly. It stays up there for months, sometimes years, acting like a massive filter that blocks sunlight from reaching Earth's surface. And this wasn't just a little bit of ash. This was enough ash to dim the sun significantly across the entire northern hemisphere. The first signs that something was terribly wrong started appearing in China. Chinese chronicles from 536 describe the sun becoming dimmer and dimmer each day. They wrote about a dry fog that couldn't be dispersed by wind or rain, a fog that seemed to absorb light itself. European monks began recording similar observations. They wrote about the sun appearing bluish and giving off no more heat than the moon. One Byzantine historian, Procopius, wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. But here's what makes this even more terrifying. People in 536 had no concept of global events. If you lived in Europe, you had no idea that anything had happened in Indonesia. You had no framework for understanding that a mountain exploding on the other side of the world could affect your daily life. So, when the sun started dimming, people assumed it was supernatural, divine punishment, the end times, demons taking over the heavens. Their explanations were often more frightening than the reality. Some thought God was angry about human sinfulness. Others believed the devil was literally blocking out the sun to bring about the apocalypse. A few optimistic souls thought it might be a sign of Christ's second coming. But most people were just terrified and confused. The temperature began dropping almost immediately. Spring turned into endless winter. Snow fell in summer. Frost killed crops that should have been thriving. And this wasn't just local weather weirdness. This was happening everywhere, from Ireland to China, from Scandinavia to North Africa. The entire northern hemisphere was experiencing the same impossible climate. What people didn't understand was that they were living through the first recorded nuclear winter in human history, not caused by atomic bombs, but by volcanic ash that was having the exact same effect. The Earth's average temperature dropped by several degrees, which might not sound like much, but when you're talking about global averages, a few degrees means the difference between normal weather and an ice age. And remember, these people were already living on the edge of survival. They had no emergency food supplies, no heating systems beyond wood fires. No way to import food from unaffected regions because there were no unaffected regions. The stage was now set for the worst year in human history, and nobody had any idea what was coming next. Now imagine you're a peasant farmer in what we now call France. You wake up one morning in late spring, expecting a normal day. The sun should be bright and warm, perfect for tending your crops. But instead, you step outside and the world looks wrong. The sun is there, but it's dim and strange, like looking at it through thick cloth. The air feels cold, unnaturally cold for this time of year. Your neighbors are standing in their doorways, pointing at the sky, whispering, looking terrified, because nobody has ever seen anything like this before. The first reaction across Europe was pure primal fear. People genuinely thought the world was ending. And honestly, given their limited understanding of how the world worked, it was a pretty reasonable conclusion. The sun was supposed to be reliable. It rose every morning, provided warmth and light, and set every evening. It had been doing this for as long as anyone could remember, for as long as their parents could remember, for as long as their grandparents could remember. And now it wasn't working properly. In medieval thinking, if something this fundamental was breaking down, it meant God was either very angry or the devil was taking over. There really weren't any other explanations available. Churches filled up with people praying for forgiveness, because clearly humanity had done something terrible to deserve this punishment. Priests were overwhelmed with confessions as people desperately tried to figure out what sins they committed that could cause the sun to malfunction. Some communities organized massive public prayer sessions, fasting, self-flagellation, anything that might convince God to fix the sky. But as days turned into weeks and the weird, dim sunlight continued, panic turned into something deeper. Despair mixed with wild theories about what was really happening. The conspiracy theories of 536 were absolutely wild. Some people believed that evil sorcerers had cast a spell on the sun. Others thought that demons had built a giant wall in the heavens to block God's light. There were rumors that the Jews had somehow poisoned the air itself, that foreign armies had discovered magical weapons that could control the weather, that the Antichrist had finally arrived and was demonstrating his power. One popular theory was that the sun was literally dying. Like a person or an animal, people thought celestial bodies could get sick and die. So communities started organizing rituals to heal the sun. They lit massive bonfires, hoping to give the sun extra strength. They sacrificed animals, hoping to feed the dying star. They created elaborate ceremonies where entire villages would sing and dance, trying to encourage the sun to burn brighter. In Ireland, Celtic Druids convinced people that the old gods were angry about the spread of Christianity. The solution? Return to ancient pagan rituals. Make offerings to the sun god. Abandon this new Christian religion that had obviously offended the natural order. In Constantinople, the heart of the Byzantine Empire, intellectuals were coming up with slightly more sophisticated theories, but only slightly. Some scholars suggested that the sun was being blocked by invisible demons. Others proposed that the Earth had somehow moved farther away from the sun. A few even theorized that a giant dragon was slowly swallowing the sun from the inside out. The really educated people, the ones who could read and had access to ancient texts, started searching for prophecies and predictions. They found passages in religious writings that seemed to predict exactly this kind of celestial catastrophe, which only made everyone more convinced that this was definitely the end times. Trade networks, which were already fragile, started breaking down as merchants refused to travel. If the world was ending, why risk dangerous journeys? If demons were controlling the weather, the roads probably weren't safe either. Cities that depended on food from the countryside started hoarding whatever supplies they had. Farmers, dealing with crops that weren't growing properly in the dim light and cold temperatures, stopped bringing produce to markets. They needed to save everything for their own families. Social tensions escalated quickly. If this was divine punishment for human sinfulness, Then people started looking around for the sinners who were obviously responsible. Accusations flew. Neighbor turned against neighbor. Anyone who was different. Anyone who practiced different customs or religions. Anyone who had been successful when others were struggling. They all became potential scapegoats for God's anger. The stage was set for the social breakdown that would characterize the rest of this nightmare year. But the weird, dim sun was just the beginning. People had no idea that the temperature was about to drop even further, that their crops were about to fail completely, and that diseases, unlike anything they'd ever experienced, were already spreading across the trade routes, heading their way. While ordinary people were panicking and coming up with wild theories about dying suns and demonic invasions, the authorities were facing their own special kind of nightmare. Because when you're in charge of keeping society running and the fundamental laws of nature seem to have broken down, what exactly are you supposed to do? Let's start with Emperor Justinian in Constantinople. This guy had spent the past 9 years consolidating power, planning military campaigns, and dreaming of reconquering the entire Roman Empire. He had architects designing the most magnificent cathedral the world had ever seen, the Hagia Sophia. He had generals preparing to invade Italy and North Africa. He had tax collectors squeezing every possible coin out of his subjects to fund these ambitious projects. And then the sun started malfunctioning. Justinian's first reaction was probably something like, "Seriously? Right now? I'm trying to restore the glory of Rome and the universe decides to have a breakdown?" But he was an experienced politician. He knew that showing panic would only make things worse. So the official imperial response was measured and authoritative. Royal proclamations assured citizens that this was a temporary celestial phenomenon, that God was testing the faithful, that the empire was strong enough to weather any crisis. Behind closed doors, though, Justinian was probably freaking out just as much as everyone else. His advisors were giving him completely contradictory advice. Military commanders wanted to increase security because desperate people might rebel. Treasury officials were worried about tax collections if the agricultural economy collapsed. Religious leaders were demanding more funding for churches and monasteries because clearly this required serious divine intervention. And nobody had any idea what was actually happening or how long it might last. The Christian church authorities faced a particularly tricky situation. On one hand, they needed to reassure people that God was still in control, that this wasn't the end of the world, that faithful Christians would be protected. On the other hand, they also needed to explain why God would allow such a terrifying thing to happen. Their solution was to frame it as a test of faith, similar to the trials faced by Job in the Bible. God was allowing Satan to test humanity's devotion. The darker the skies became, the brighter Christian faith should shine. It was actually pretty clever messaging. Local rulers across Europe were dealing with more immediate problems. Village chiefs, tribal leaders, and minor nobles were the ones actually responsible for keeping people fed and preventing riots. And they were working with exactly zero useful information about what was causing the crisis or how long it might last. Some local authorities tried to project confidence by organizing public works projects. Sure, the sun looks weird, but we're still building this new bridge because everything is totally normal. Others went the opposite direction and organized massive religious ceremonies. This is obviously a spiritual crisis, so we need spiritual solutions. A few pragmatic leaders started quietly stockpiling grain and organizing rationing systems. Because regardless of what was causing the weird weather, if crops failed, people would starve. And starving people tend to become rebellious people very quickly. In Britain, various Saxon kings were dealing with the additional challenge of ruling recently conquered territories. The native Celtic populations were already resentful of Saxon rule. Now, with the sun acting strange and crops failing, Celtic druids were saying, "See, the old gods are angry about these foreign invaders." This is what happens when you abandon the traditional ways. Some Saxon leaders tried to crack down harder on Celtic resistance. Others attempted to co-opt local religious leaders by incorporating pagan rituals into Christian ceremonies. Most just hoped the whole thing would blow over before their political authority completely collapsed. The Frankish kingdoms in what we now call France were experiencing similar problems. King Childebert was trying to maintain control over a collection of rival tribes who were already looking for excuses to fight each other. The mysterious sun dimming gave every ambitious noble a perfect opportunity to claim that God disapproved of the current leadership. Clearly, the king has lost divine favor. It's time for new leadership. Meanwhile, Visigothic Spain was dealing with religious tensions between Arian Christians and Catholic Christians. Both groups claimed that the solar crisis proved their version of Christianity was correct, and the other version had angered God. It was like having a theological debate while the world appeared to be ending. The really smart authorities started sending messengers to other regions, trying to figure out if this was a local problem or something bigger. But communication was slow, and the news they were getting back was uniformly bad. The sun was dim everywhere. Crops were failing everywhere. People were panicking everywhere. This wasn't a regional crisis that could be solved with local resources. This was something unprecedented that required solutions nobody had ever had to think about before. Just when people thought things couldn't get any weirder, the temperature started dropping. And I'm not talking about a slightly chilly day where you need to grab a sweater. I'm talking about summer temperatures that felt like winter. Snow falling in July, frost covering crops that should have been ripening in the warm sun. The volcanic ash in the atmosphere was doing exactly what nuclear fallout would do thousands of years later, blocking solar radiation, reflecting sunlight back into space, turning the entire northern hemisphere into a giant refrigerator. In Ireland, monks recorded snow falling continuously for months during what should have been the warmest part of the year. They wrote about rivers freezing solid in summer, about livestock dying from cold in the middle of July, about having to burn furniture just to stay warm because they'd already used up all their winter firewood supplies. The Mediterranean, which was supposed to be sunny and warm year-round, started experiencing weather that belonged in Scandinavia. Olive groves that had been growing for centuries suddenly died from frost. Vineyards that had been producing wine since Roman times were destroyed by freezing temperatures. Fish populations crashed as the water temperatures dropped beyond what marine life could tolerate. But here's where it gets really absurd. The global nature of this climate catastrophe meant that normal coping strategies didn't work. Usually, if one region had a bad harvest, they could import food from other areas. Not this time. Every agricultural region in the northern hemisphere was experiencing the same crop failures simultaneously. China was recording the coldest summer in recorded history. Chronicles describe yellow dust falling from the sky, rivers changing color, crops withering in fields despite farmers' best efforts. The Chinese emperor ordered special prayers and sacrifices, convinced that the mandate of heaven was being withdrawn from his dynasty. In Scandinavia, where people were somewhat used to cold weather, the extended winter was still catastrophic. The growing season was so short that even hardy northern crops couldn't mature. Fishing became difficult, as normal fish migration patterns were disrupted by the temperature changes. Even the Vikings, who were arguably the most adaptable people in Europe, were struggling to find enough food. The really crazy part was how fast the effects cascaded. First, the immediate crops failed. Wheat, barley, oats, everything that people depended on for basic survival. Then the secondary effects kicked in. Livestock started dying because there wasn't enough grain to feed them. Dairy production crashed because cows were either dead or too malnourished to produce milk. Even wild animals were struggling. Forests that normally provided nuts, berries, and game were producing almost nothing. People who lived by hunting and gathering found that there was simply nothing to hunt or gather. The economic systems that had been functioning, however primitively, began breaking down completely. Merchants couldn't travel because the roads were impassable due to unusual weather. Even if they could travel, there was nothing to trade because every region was dealing with the same shortages. Currency became meaningless when there was literally no food to buy. Barter systems emerged, but even those were problematic. What do you trade when nobody has surplus anything? Social hierarchies started collapsing as well. Nobles who had relied on tribute from peasant farmers found themselves with empty granaries. Kings, who had maintained power through their ability to redistribute resources to loyal followers, suddenly had no resources to redistribute. The feudal system, which was based on everyone having defined roles in food production and distribution, simply stopped working when there was no food to produce or distribute. Religious authorities found themselves in the bizarre position of trying to explain why God's creation seemed to be malfunctioning. Prayer services that had been organized to fix the sun were expanded to address the temperature problems, the weather problems, the crop problems, the livestock problems. It was becoming clear that whatever was happening was bigger than just a weird sun. This was a complete breakdown of the natural order. People started abandoning their homes and traveling to other regions, hoping to find somewhere that still had food. But everywhere they went, they found the same problems. Refugees were competing with local populations for resources that didn't exist. Communities that had been stable for generations were being overwhelmed by desperate travelers who were willing to do anything for a meal. Violence was becoming inevitable, and this was still just the beginning. The crop failures and temperature drops were setting the stage for social breakdown, mass migration, and conflicts that would reshape the political map of Europe. But the worst was yet to come, because while people were dealing with cold and hunger, a disease was already spreading along the trade routes. A plague unlike anything the world had ever experienced. So now we've got global crop failures, freezing temperatures in summer, livestock dying everywhere. You might think, okay, that's terrible, but people are resourceful. They'll figure something out. Well, they did figure something out. And what they figured out was absolutely horrifying. When people are truly starving, when there's literally no food left anywhere, when children are dying in their arms, when death is inevitable unless they do something unthinkable, they start making choices that would be completely unimaginable under normal circumstances. The first reports of cannibalism started appearing in chronicles from across Europe within just a few months of the crisis beginning. And we're not talking about isolated incidents. We're talking about widespread, systematic cannibalism as communities ran out of alternatives. Irish annals describe families eating their own dead relatives rather than burying them. Because when you haven't eaten in weeks and your grandfather just died from starvation anyway, the choice between survival and social taboos becomes pretty clear. French chronicles record markets where human flesh was being sold alongside whatever scraps of normal food could still be found. Merchants who had been trading in grain and livestock suddenly found themselves in a completely different business, because demand creates supply even when that supply is unspeakable. The most disturbing reports come from areas around Constantinople. Byzantine historians, who usually wrote in very formal, diplomatic language, suddenly started using words and phrases that revealed their own shock and horror. They describe parents making impossible choices about which children to save and which to sacrifice. They write about neighbors who had lived peacefully together for decades suddenly viewing each other as potential food sources. But cannibalism wasn't even the worst of it, because at least cannibalism was motivated by survival instinct. The social breakdown went much deeper than that. Legal systems that had maintained order for centuries simply stopped functioning. When judges are starving, courts don't convene. When sheriffs are dead from malnutrition, laws aren't enforced. When local authorities have fled to find food elsewhere, there's nobody left to maintain basic social contracts. Banditry exploded as the desperate people organized into armed groups to take whatever resources they could find. But these weren't your typical highway robbers looking for gold or valuables. These were starving families attacking other starving families for their last handful of grain. Villages that had existed peacefully for generations suddenly became fortified camps, with residents standing guard against their former neighbors. The economic collapse was unlike anything Europe had experienced, even during the fall of Rome. At least when Rome fell, there were still crops growing and animals producing food. This was different. This was the complete breakdown of the fundamental basis of all economic activity: food production. You can't have commerce when there's nothing to sell. You can't have currency when there's nothing to buy. You can't have taxation when there's nothing to tax. Even the most basic forms of wealth became meaningless. Gold couldn't be eaten. Silver didn't provide warmth. Land was worthless if it couldn't grow anything. Nobles who had accumulated vast fortunes found themselves just as hungry as the peasants they'd once ruled over. Some of the wealthiest people in Europe died of starvation because money simply couldn't solve a problem this fundamental. The population movements were staggering. Entire communities abandoned their ancestral homes and started walking. Just walking, hoping to find somewhere that still had food. Since the crisis was global, these refugee populations were wandering into regions that were dealing with exactly the same problems. Britain experienced massive migrations from Ireland and Scotland as people fled the worst affected areas. But England was also starving, so these refugees were competing with locals for resources that didn't exist. Continental Europe saw similar patterns. Germanic tribes that had been settled for centuries suddenly became nomadic again, not by choice, but out of desperation. They moved south into territories controlled by other tribes, creating conflicts that had nothing to do with politics or territory and everything to do with survival. The Frankish kingdoms were overwhelmed by populations fleeing from the east and north. Spain received refugees from both northern Europe and North Africa, but nowhere was safe. Nowhere had surplus food. The infrastructure for handling large refugee populations simply didn't exist. Roads became clogged with desperate travelers. Rivers and wells were contaminated by the massive numbers of people and animals trying to use the same water sources. Sanitation systems that had been barely adequate for stable populations completely broke down under the pressure of constant migration. And here's the thing that makes this even more tragic. People were making these desperate journeys based on rumors and false hope. Stories would spread that somewhere, somehow, there was still food available. Entire families would abandon whatever shelter they had and walk hundreds of miles chasing these rumors, only to find more starvation at their destination. Just when you think this story has reached peak horror, just when you're convinced that humanity has faced every possible catastrophe, just when you're thinking, well, at least it can't get any worse than global starvation and cannibalism, the universe decides to prove you wrong. Because apparently 536 AD wasn't satisfied with just being the year of climate catastrophe. It also wanted to be the year of the first truly global pandemic. Enter the Justinian Plague, named after our poor Emperor Justinian, who was already dealing with dimmed suns, crop failures, and social collapse. And now he was about to face a disease that would make modern pandemics look like a mild cold. This wasn't just any plague. This was bubonic plague, the same bacteria that would later cause the Black Death in the 14th century. But this was the world premiere. Humanity's first encounter with Yersinia pestis on a global scale, and people had absolutely no idea what they were dealing with. The plague probably started in Central Asia, among rodent populations that were already stressed by the climate catastrophe. Rats and other animals were migrating in unusual patterns because their normal food sources had disappeared. And wherever the rats went, their fleas went with them. And wherever the fleas went, the plague bacteria went along for the ride. Trade routes that had been disrupted by the climate crisis were still functioning sporadically. Merchants were desperate to find any goods they could still trade. Ships were still sailing between ports, carrying whatever cargo they could find. And unfortunately, they were also carrying rats. Infected rats with infected fleas. The first reports of the plague started appearing in port cities around the Mediterranean in late 536. But remember, people had no understanding of how diseases spread. They didn't know about bacteria. They had never heard of fleas carrying infections. Their medical understanding was still based on balancing bodily humors and divine punishment. So when people started developing massive, painful swellings in their armpits and groins, when they started running fevers that made them delirious, when they started dying within days of showing symptoms, The initial reaction was, great. Now, God is sending a new punishment on top of the sun and weather problems. Symptoms were unlike anything physicians had ever seen. These weren't the familiar diseases that medieval doctors sort of knew how to treat with bloodletting and herbs. The bubonic swellings were enormous, sometimes as large as apples. They turned black and purple. They leaked fluid. They smelled terrible. And worst of all, they appeared to be contagious. Families that cared for sick relatives started developing the same symptoms within days. The plague spread through Constantinople like wildfire. The capital of the Byzantine Empire, with its dense population and busy ports, was the perfect environment for a highly contagious disease. Justinian's grand plans for reconquering the Mediterranean were suddenly irrelevant. His armies were dying faster than they could be replaced. His tax base was literally disappearing as entire communities were wiped out. But here's what made the Justinian plague even more devastating than later plague outbreaks. People were already weakened by months of malnutrition. Their immune systems were compromised by starvation and stress. Their social support systems had already collapsed due to the climate crisis. So when the plague arrived, it found populations that were uniquely vulnerable. Mortality rates were absolutely staggering. Some communities lost 40% of their population within months. Entire cities became ghost towns as survivors fled, carrying the infection with them to new locations. The infrastructure for dealing with mass death simply didn't exist. There weren't enough healthy people to bury the dead. Bodies were stacked in buildings, thrown into rivers, or left to rot in the streets. The smell of decomposition became a permanent feature of urban life, and the psychological impact was almost as devastating as the physical toll. People who had survived the climate crisis, who had endured starvation and social breakdown, who had made unthinkable moral compromises just to stay alive. Now they were watching their families die from a mysterious disease that seemed to strike randomly. Some plague victims died within days. Others lingered for weeks. A few seemed to recover, only to die suddenly from complications. There was no pattern anyone could understand. No way to predict who would survive and who wouldn't. The combination of ongoing starvation and epidemic disease created a feedback loop of horror. Sick people needed care and nutrition to recover, but there was no food to provide nutrition, and healthy people were afraid to provide care because they might catch the plague themselves. Medical knowledge was not just inadequate, it was actively harmful. Doctors were still recommending bloodletting for plague victims, which only weakened them further. They were prescribing herbal treatments that did nothing. They were organizing mass prayer sessions that only helped spread the infection faster. So now you've got starving populations, cannibalism, mass migration, and a plague that's killing people faster than they can be buried. At this point, you might think people would band together, unite against the common threats, work collectively to survive the crisis. Yeah, that's not what happened. Instead, 536 became the year when human societies turned on themselves with a viciousness that was almost as devastating as the natural disasters. The social fabric that had held communities together for generations just completely unraveled. In the Byzantine Empire, Justinian was facing rebellions from multiple directions simultaneously. Military commanders who hadn't been paid because the tax system had collapsed were refusing to follow orders. Provincial governors were declaring independence because the central government couldn't provide any support or resources. Entire regions were essentially seceding from the empire, not for political reasons, but because imperial authority had become completely irrelevant to their daily survival. The famous Nika riots had happened just a few years earlier, in 532, but those were political protests by organized factions. What was happening now was different. This was pure desperation turning into violence. Starving mobs were attacking government buildings not to make political statements, but to search for hidden food supplies. They were targeting wealthy neighborhoods not to redistribute wealth, but to find anything edible. Religious conflicts exploded across Europe as different Christian sects blamed each other for bringing God's wrath upon the world. Arian Christians accused Catholic Christians of heresy that had angered God. Catholics blamed Arians for corrupting true faith. Both groups turned on remaining pagan populations, accusing them of practicing dark magic that had caused the sun to dim. And everyone was suspicious of Jews, because anti-Semitism was always a convenient explanation for inexplicable disasters. In Ireland, the Christian conversion that had been progressing peacefully for decades suddenly became violent as people blamed the new religion for the crisis. Celtic Druids convinced communities to abandon Christianity and return to the old gods. But Christian missionaries fought back, leading to religious wars that made the starvation and plague even worse. Because nothing says, let's survive this apocalypse together, like killing each other over theological differences. Tribal conflicts that have been dormant for years suddenly reignited as groups competed for dwindling resources. Saxon kingdoms and Britain started attacking each other instead of working together against a common crisis. Germanic tribes that had settled peacefully in former Roman territories began fighting wars of extermination because sharing resources was no longer an option when there were no resources to share. The Frankish kingdoms dissolved into civil wars as rival claimants to various thrones decided that seizing power was more important than keeping their subjects alive. Because apparently, being king of a starving wasteland was still preferable to being a commoner in a starving wasteland. Even within individual communities, social bonds were breaking down in horrifying ways. Families were splitting apart as parents abandoned children they couldn't feed. Children were running away from families that might eat them. Marriages were dissolving as spouses chose individual survival over mutual support. Neighbors were betraying neighbors to authorities in exchange for food rations that probably didn't exist anyway. The most tragic conflicts were happening within extended families and kinship groups. Clans that had maintained solidarity for centuries were fracturing as different branches competed for ancestral lands that were no longer producing anything. Brothers were fighting brothers over inheritances that consisted of nothing but empty granaries and dead livestock. Age-old alliances between communities were breaking down as former allies raided each other for supplies. Villages that had traded peacefully for generations were now fortifying themselves against attacks from their traditional trading partners. Trust, which had been the foundation of all economic and social relationships, simply evaporated. In urban areas, guild systems that had organized craftsmen and merchants for decades collapsed as their economic basis disappeared. Blacksmiths had no iron to work with. Bakers had no grain to bake. Merchants had nothing to sell. But instead of working together to find solutions, guild members were fighting over the few remaining tools and materials. Professional associations became armed gangs competing for resources. Church hierarchies were fracturing as local priests defied bishops who couldn't provide support for their starving congregations. Monasteries that had been centers of learning and charity were closing their doors to refugees because they couldn't feed their own monks. Some religious communities split into factions that accused each other of insufficient faith or secret sinfulness that had brought divine punishment. The most devastating aspect of these internal conflicts was how they prevented effective responses to the ongoing crises. Instead of organizing collective action against starvation and disease, people were wasting their remaining energy fighting each other. Instead of pooling resources for survival, they were destroying what little infrastructure remained. Communities that might have survived through cooperation were ensuring their own destruction through conflict. Okay, so humanity is facing simultaneous climate catastrophe, mass starvation, plague, and social collapse. Clearly, this calls for some serious problem solving, some innovative thinking, some rational analysis of cause and effect. What actually happened was a collection of solutions so bizarre and counterproductive that they probably made everything worse. But hey, when you're living in the 6th century and your understanding of science is God controls everything, your problem-solving strategies are going to be a little unconventional. Let's start with the religious solutions, because medieval people were absolutely convinced that this was all about divine punishment. The obvious answer was to pray harder. Much harder, like really commit to this prayer thing. Churches organized marathon prayer sessions that lasted for days. Entire communities would gather and pray nonstop, taking shifts so that the prayers never stopped because apparently God was impressed by endurance rather than sincerity. Some communities decided that regular prayer wasn't dramatic enough. They needed to really get God's attention. So they organized massive public flagellation ceremonies where hundreds of people would whip themselves bloody while begging for forgiveness. Because nothing says, please fix the sun, like a group self-torture session. The logic was that if human sinfulness had caused the crisis, then extreme human suffering might convince God to fix it. Other communities went the opposite direction and organized enormous festivals and celebrations. Their theory was that God was sad, and if they could cheer him up with music and dancing, maybe he'd restore normal weather. These festivals were particularly surreal because people were literally starving while trying to throw parties to entertain the Almighty. Picture people who haven't eaten in weeks, forcing themselves to sing happy songs because they think it might bring back the sun. The medical solutions were equally ridiculous. Physicians who didn't understand bacteria or climate science were nevertheless confident they could fix everything with their traditional methods. The plague was obviously caused by bad air, so they recommended burning aromatic herbs to purify the atmosphere. Entire cities were constantly filled with smoke from burning rosemary, sage, and whatever other herbs people thought might clean the air. This probably made the respiratory symptoms worse, but hey, at least everything smelled nice while people were dying. Bloodletting was prescribed not just for individual patients, but as a community-wide solution. Some physicians convinced entire villages that everyone needed to be bled simultaneously to restore the cosmic balance of humors. They organized mass bloodletting events where weakened, malnourished people voluntarily made themselves even weaker because medical authorities assured them it would help. For the climate problems, there were some truly spectacular attempted solutions. Since the sun appeared to be dying, some communities decided to help it by creating earthly suns. They built enormous bonfires that burned continuously for months, hoping to give the real sun extra strength. The amount of precious firewood they wasted on these symbolic suns could have kept people warm through the actual cold weather, but symbolism was apparently more important than practical heating. Other communities tried to literally feed the sun by throwing food into fires. Bread, meat, whatever food they could find was burned in ceremonial offerings because someone had decided that the sun was hungry. People who were starving to death were burning their last bits of food because they thought it might restore normal daylight. The agricultural solutions were just as bizarre. Farmers who didn't understand that the problem was global climate change tried increasingly desperate techniques to make their crops grow. They organized elaborate planting ceremonies with music, dancing, and ritualistic blessing of seeds. They tried planting during different moon phases because surely the timing was just wrong. They experimented with burying various objects in their fields. Metal tools, religious relics, animal bones, anything that might have magical properties that could restore fertility to the soil. Some communities decided that the earth itself was sick and needed medicine. They poured various liquids into the ground. Wine, milk, blood from sacrificed animals, even human urine, because someone had convinced them that the soil needed to drink healing potions just like sick people did. For the plague, the solutions were particularly creative. Since no one understood how diseases spread, they tried to protect themselves with elaborate combinations of herbs, amulets, and prayers. People wore garlic around their necks, carried rabbit feet, and recited specific incantations while walking through cities full of dead bodies. Some communities tried to literally scare the plague away by making loud noises. They organized coordinated shouting sessions where everyone would yell at the same time, hoping to frighten the disease into leaving their territory. So we've covered the dim sun, the freezing summer, the mass starvation, the cannibalism, the plague, the social collapse, the ridiculous attempted solutions. You're probably thinking, okay, that's already more catastrophe than any year should contain. Surely that's everything. But 536 AD was apparently competing for some kind of cosmic record for most impossible year ever, because the natural phenomena that started showing up next were so bizarre that even people living through multiple apocalypses simultaneously couldn't believe what they were seeing. Let's talk about the red rain. Not metaphorical red rain. Not slightly pinkish rain that can be explained by dust or pollen. We're talking about rain that was literally blood red, falling from the sky, staining everything it touched. Chroniclers across Europe recorded this phenomenon with a kind of language usually reserved for describing the end of the world. Because from their perspective, that's exactly what it was. Byzantine historians wrote about crimson water falling from the heavens for days at a time. Irish monks described rain that looked like blood and smelled like iron. French chronicles mentioned red precipitation that killed plants and contaminated water supplies. And these weren't isolated reports from one confused observer. This was happening across multiple regions, recorded by multiple independent sources who had no way to coordinate their stories. The red rain was probably caused by particles of volcanic ash and mineral dust that had been circulating in the atmosphere for months. When these particles mixed with water vapor, they created precipitation that was genuinely red. But try explaining atmospheric chemistry to a 6th century monk who is already convinced that God is angry about something. As far as they were concerned, the sky was literally bleeding. Then there were the atmospheric light phenomena that defied all explanation. People reported seeing multiple suns in the sky, not sundogs or atmospheric reflections that we might recognize today. These were descriptions of bright lights that appeared and disappeared randomly, sometimes in formations that looked almost geometric. Some observers reported seeing what looked like armies fighting in the clouds. Battles between warriors made of light, complete with weapons and banners. Others described flying objects that moved in patterns unlike any bird or cloud formation. Dragons made of fire crossing the sky. Pillars of light that connected the ground to the heavens. Remember, these people had never seen airplanes. They had never heard of optical illusions caused by atmospheric particles. When they saw something moving in the sky that wasn't a bird, their explanations involved angels, demons, or divine manifestations. And they were seeing a lot of things that weren't birds. The electromagnetic effects of the massive volcanic eruption were creating aurora displays at latitudes where they had never been seen before. People in southern Europe were witnessing northern lights for the first time in recorded history, but they didn't know what aurora were. They interpreted these dancing colored lights as supernatural battles between forces of good and evil. Some communities were convinced they were watching the armies of heaven preparing for the final judgment. Sound phenomena were equally bizarre. People reported hearing massive explosions that seemed to come from underground or from the sky, but with no visible source. Rumbling sounds that lasted for hours without any apparent cause. Voices calling from empty air. Music that seemed to come from the clouds themselves. These were probably caused by unusual atmospheric pressure changes, seismic activity from the global climate disruption, and audio hallucinations brought on by stress and malnutrition. But medieval people interpreted them as the voices of God, angels, or demons communicating messages about the fate of humanity. The timeline of disasters was so compressed and so extreme that chroniclers were running out of language to describe what they were witnessing. One Irish annalist wrote something like, "In this year the sun gave no light, snow fell in summer, the earth shook, red rain fell from heaven, voices were heard in the air, and plague consumed the people. What more can be written of such a year?" The fact that multiple impossible things were happening simultaneously made each individual phenomenon seem even more supernatural. If just one weird thing had happened, people might have found rational explanations. But when everything was weird at the same time, the only possible explanation was that the natural order of the universe had completely broken down. Some communities became convinced that time itself was malfunctioning. Days seemed longer because of the dim light. Seasons were completely disrupted by the temperature changes. People lost track of dates and religious festivals because their normal seasonal markers had disappeared. When you can't tell what month it is because it's snowing in summer and dark at noon, your sense of reality starts to break down pretty quickly. Now here's where this story gets really wild. Because 536 AD wasn't just a terrible year that people survived and then forgot about. This was a year that literally changed the course of human history. The effects of this climate catastrophe rippled through time in ways that shaped the world we live in today. And most people have no idea that some of the biggest historical changes they learned about in school actually started with a volcano in Indonesia, making the sun disappear. Let's start with the obvious one. Emperor Justinian's dreams of reconquering the Roman Empire. Remember, this guy had been planning the most ambitious military campaign in centuries. He wanted to retake Italy from the Ostrogoths, reclaim North Africa from the Vandals, restore Roman control over the entire Mediterranean. He had the armies, he had the resources, he had the political will, and then 536 happened. Suddenly, instead of conquering foreign territories, Justinian was trying to keep his own empire from collapsing. His tax base was literally dying from starvation and plague. His armies were decimated by disease. His administrative system was overwhelmed by refugee populations and social breakdown. The resources he had planned to spend on glorious military campaigns were being used just to maintain basic governmental functions. If Medlov 136 hadn't happened, Justinian might actually have succeeded in reunifying the Roman Empire. Think about how that would have changed European history. No medieval period as we know it. No rise of independent European kingdoms. Possibly no crusades. Definitely no Renaissance in the same form. The entire trajectory of Western civilization was altered because a volcano made it impossible for Justinian to complete his military ambitions. The plague that started in 536 continued circulating for decades. This wasn't a one-year crisis that ended when the weather improved. The Justinian plague kept returning in waves, like a preview of what the Black Death would do 8 centuries later. Population levels across Europe and the Mediterranean didn't recover for generations. Some regions lost 40% of their population and didn't return to pre-536 levels until the 10th or 11th centuries. When you lose nearly half your population, everything changes. Economic systems, political structures, cultural traditions, social hierarchies. Many communities simply disappeared entirely. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned and never resettled. Archaeological evidence shows that some regions of Europe were essentially depopulated and remained that way for hundreds of years. The demographic collapse created power vacuums that were filled by groups who might never have gained influence under normal circumstances. In Britain, the Saxon kingdoms expanded much more rapidly than they otherwise would have because the Romano-British populations were devastated by the climate crisis and plague. Celtic communities that might have maintained independence were too weakened to resist Saxon expansion.
In continental Europe, tribal groups that had been minor players suddenly became major powers because their rivals had been wiped out by starvation and disease. The Frankish kingdoms, which would eventually become the foundation of medieval France and Germany, gained territory and influence partly because they survived 536 better than their competitors.
The crisis also accelerated the spread of Christianity in unexpected ways. Pagan communities that had been resistant to Christian conversion suddenly became receptive when their traditional gods failed to protect them from obviously supernatural disasters. If the old gods couldn't prevent the sun from disappearing, maybe the Christian god was more powerful. Entire regions converted to Christianity not through missionary work or political pressure, but through desperation and the obvious failure of traditional religious systems. But the most profound long-term effect was psychological and cultural. The generation that survived 536 passed down stories that shaped how people thought about the world for centuries afterward. The idea that civilization was fragile, that the natural order could break down without warning, that multiple disasters could strike simultaneously. This created a fundamentally different worldview than previous generations had held. Medieval European culture, with its emphasis on preparing for the end times and its assumption that life was inherently precarious, was partly shaped by the collective trauma of 536. The fear that another year like 536 could happen at any time influenced everything from architectural styles to agricultural practices to political theories. Art from the following centuries shows clear influences of 536 trauma. Religious manuscripts are filled with apocalyptic imagery that seems directly inspired by eyewitness accounts of the climate crisis. The medieval obsession with signs and portents, the tendency to interpret unusual weather as divine communication, the assumption that natural disasters were always supernatural in origin. All of this can be traced back to 536 and the way it fundamentally changed how people understood their relationship with the natural world. So we've reached the peak. Dawn. The absolute climax of 536 AD. The moment when every single catastrophe that had been building throughout the year decided to happen simultaneously. If this were a disaster movie, this would be the scene where the audience is yelling at the screen, because there's no way this many things could go wrong at the same time. Except this really happened. Picture it's now late autumn, 536. The sun has been dim for almost an entire year. Crops have failed completely across multiple continents. The plague is spreading faster than people can flee from it. Societies are collapsing. People are eating each other. And just when you think the universe has exhausted its capacity for horror, everything accelerates. The plague reaches Constantinople at exactly the same time that the winter weather becomes impossible to survive. People who might have recovered from the disease are dying because there's no fuel for heating and no food for nutrition. Sick people who need care are being abandoned because healthy people are afraid of infection. Dead bodies are piling up faster than survivors can dispose of them. And remember, this is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, the center of the civilized world. If Constantinople is collapsing, everywhere else is even worse. Justinian himself catches the plague. The emperor who had been trying to hold his empire together through pure force of will is now lying in bed with massive bubonic swellings, probably delirious with fever, while his empire disintegrates around him. He actually survives, which is almost more remarkable than if he had died, because somehow, against all odds, he recovers just in time to witness the complete breakdown of everything he had spent his life building. The refugee crisis reaches insane proportions as entire populations abandon regions that have become uninhabitable. But there's nowhere to go. Every destination is dealing with the same problems. So you have massive groups of starving, diseased people wandering across Europe with no plan except to keep moving until they find somewhere that isn't a wasteland. These refugee populations are spreading plague faster than it could have spread naturally. They're overwhelming the few communities that might have survived on their own. They're creating conflicts everywhere they go because desperate people are competing for resources that don't exist. It's like a feedback loop of disaster where each problem makes every other problem worse. Meanwhile, the natural phenomena are reaching peak weirdness. The red rain is falling more frequently. The atmospheric light shows are becoming more spectacular and more terrifying. The strange sounds from the sky are getting louder and more frequent. People are reporting phenomena that sound like science fiction. Balls of light moving in formation. Sounds like massive machines operating underground. Weather patterns that change hour by hour with no discernible logic. And all of this is happening while people are trying to survive the most basic challenges of finding food and avoiding disease. Imagine trying to figure out how to feed your starving family while the sky is literally raining blood, and you can hear unexplained explosions coming from the clouds. The psychological pressure was breaking people's minds. Chroniclers describe mass hysteria events where entire communities would suddenly start behaving irrationally. Group hallucinations, collective delusions, religious movements that sprung up overnight and disappeared just as quickly when their prophecies failed to materialize. Some people became convinced they were already dead and living in hell. Others decided they were experiencing the biblical end times and started acting accordingly, which meant everything from extreme asceticism to complete moral abandonment. Social structures that had taken centuries to develop were collapsing in months. Kings were abandoning their kingdoms. Priests were losing their faith. Merchants were giving up commerce. Farmers were walking away from their lands. People were making decisions that would have been unthinkable a year earlier because the fundamental assumptions about how the world worked had been proven completely wrong. The most terrifying aspect was the speed of the breakdown. Earlier in the year, people could still imagine that things might return to normal, that this was a temporary crisis that would eventually end. By late 536, it was becoming clear that normal might not exist anymore, that the world they had known might be gone forever. that they might be witnessing the actual end of civilization. And for many communities, that's exactly what was happening. Archaeological evidence shows that some settlements were abandoned during this period and never reoccupied. Entire regions went from populated and productive to empty wasteland and stayed that way for centuries. This wasn't just a bad year that people survived. For many places, this was the end of their story. By the end of 536, something extraordinary happened to the people who were still alive. After months of panic, desperation, and increasingly bizarre attempts to fix the unfixable, a strange kind of acceptance began to settle over the surviving populations. Not peaceful acceptance, not happy acceptance, but the grim, practical acceptance of people who had been pushed so far beyond their limits that they simply ran out of capacity for shock. It was like the human mind reached a saturation point where nothing could surprise anyone anymore. When you've seen your neighbors resort to cannibalism, watched the sun disappear for a year, survived a plague that killed half your community, and witnessed red rain falling from the sky, your threshold for impossible gets permanently recalibrated. People stopped trying to find explanations for what was happening. They stopped looking for someone to blame. They stopped expecting authorities to fix anything. They just focused on the immediate, practical problems of staying alive one more day. Communities that survived developed a kind of emergency pragmatism that was completely different from their previous way of life. Social hierarchies that had seemed important for centuries suddenly became irrelevant. If a former peasant was better at finding food than a former noble, the peasant became the leader. If a woman was more skilled at treating plague symptoms than the male physicians, people followed her advice. Survival became the only credential that mattered. Religious practices evolved in fascinating ways. People didn't abandon faith, but they stopped expecting miracles. Prayer became less about asking God to fix everything and more about asking for strength to endure whatever came next. Churches that had been organizing elaborate ceremonies to restore normal weather started focusing on more practical forms of community support. Sharing information about which foods were safe to eat, coordinating care for orphan children, organizing work groups to dispose of bodies and maintain basic sanitation. The survivors developed an almost supernatural ability to adapt to circumstances that would have been unthinkable just months earlier. People learned to recognize early symptoms of plague and isolate infected individuals before the disease could spread. They figured out which wild plants were edible and which were poisonous. They developed new preservation techniques for the small amounts of food they could still find. They created early warning systems for raiders and refugees. They invented new forms of shelter that could be quickly abandoned if necessary. Most remarkably, they learned to live with uncertainty in ways that previous generations never could have imagined. Medieval people had been accustomed to relatively predictable patterns: planting seasons, harvest times, religious festivals, social obligations. The rhythm of daily life had been consistent for centuries, but 536 taught the survivors that nothing was guaranteed, that everything could change overnight, that the only reasonable approach to life was flexible preparation for whatever weirdness might happen next. Communities that survived began developing what we might recognize as early forms of disaster preparedness. They maintained larger food reserves than had previously been considered necessary. They kept their populations more mobile and less attached to specific locations. They developed stronger networks with neighboring communities so they could share resources and information more quickly. They created redundant systems for essential functions like food production and defense. The psychological changes were just as profound as the practical adaptations. The generation that lived through 536 developed a fundamentally different relationship with death. When you've watched most of the people you know die from starvation or disease, death stops being a distant abstract concept and becomes a familiar presence. This wasn't morbid depression. It was more like practical acceptance that death was a normal part of daily life that needed to be planned for and managed efficiently. Children who grew up during this period learned to be resilient in ways that would have seemed impossible to previous generations. They learned to find food in places their parents had never looked, to recognize signs of disease and environmental danger that adults missed. to adapt to new situations faster than people who remember normal life. They became incredibly resourceful and pragmatic because those were the skills that kept them alive. By the end of the year, the survivors had essentially created a new kind of civilization, not intentionally, not through planning or design, but through the forced evolution of communities that had to change completely or disappear entirely. They had learned to live in a world where the fundamental assumptions about reality could be wrong, where multiple disasters could strike simultaneously, where traditional authorities and systems could become useless overnight, where individual and community survival depended on flexibility, cooperation, and the ability to make very hard choices very quickly. Now here's where the story gets really interesting from a historical perspective, because the people who survived 536 AD had experienced something so unprecedented, so impossible, so completely outside normal human experience that they faced a unique challenge. How do you tell this story to people who weren't there? How do you explain what it was like to live through the worst year in human history to your children and grandchildren who will grow up in a relatively normal world? How do you make people believe that the sun actually disappeared for an entire year without sounding completely insane? The first generation of survivors dealt with this challenge by simply not talking about it very much. The trauma was too fresh. The memories were too painful. And honestly, they were probably suffering from what we would now recognize as collective PTSD. Many people who lived through 536 spent the rest of their lives focused on just enjoying the fact that the sun was shining and food was available. They didn't want to relive those memories by telling detailed stories about them, but their children were curious. Kids who had vague memories of the terrible year, or who had been born just after it ended, wanted to understand what had happened. Why were there so many abandoned villages? Why did their parents react so strangely to minor food shortages? Why were there mass graves outside every major city? Why did the older generation seem so obsessed with stockpiling supplies and preparing for disasters? So the stories started being told. But here's the thing about traumatic memories being passed down orally across generations. They change. They get compressed and exaggerated and simplified and mythologized. Details that seemed important to the survivors get lost. Details that help the story make sense to people who weren't there get added. The technical aspects, the gradual buildup of problems, the complex interactions between different disasters, those boring parts get edited out. What remains are the most dramatic, most memorable, most emotionally powerful elements. The sun disappearing, the red rain, the voices in the sky, the impossible cold, the mass death. These become the core of the story that gets passed down. Within a generation or two, the stories of 536 had evolved into something that was technically accurate, but didn't sound remotely like real history. They sounded like religious prophecy, like mythology, like the kind of stories people tell about the end of the world, not about something that actually happened to real people. Medieval chroniclers who recorded these stories decades later struggled with how to present them. They knew that multiple independent sources were telling similar stories about the same time period, and knew that the physical evidence, the abandoned settlements, the mass graves, the changes in agricultural practices, all of this supported the idea that something extraordinary had happened in 536. But the stories themselves were so bizarre that they didn't fit into normal historical narrative. So chroniclers started framing them as religious events rather than natural disasters. The dimming sun became a sign of God's displeasure. The plague became divine punishment for human sinfulness. The strange atmospheric phenomena became evidence of supernatural intervention in human affairs. This wasn't intentional historical revisionism. This was medieval people trying to make sense of events that were outside their scientific understanding by using the explanatory frameworks available to them. The stories of 536 became foundational myths for medieval European culture. They provided a template for understanding how the world could end. They established precedents for interpreting natural disasters as supernatural communication. They created expectations about what signs and portents might indicate about divine intentions. Centuries later, when the Black Death struck Europe in the 1340s, people's understanding of that pandemic was heavily influenced by stories about the Justinian plague of 536. When Mount Vesuvius erupted in 1631, observers described it using language that echoed 536 chronicles. When unusual weather patterns occurred throughout the medieval period, people interpreted them through the lens of stories about the year the sun disappeared. But the most lasting legacy was psychological. The idea that civilization was fragile, that multiple disasters could strike simultaneously, that the natural order could break down without warning. That normal life could be interrupted by events so extreme they seemed supernatural. This worldview became baked into European culture for centuries. It influenced art, literature, religious thinking, political theory, and social organization. The medieval assumption that life was inherently precarious and that people needed to prepare for catastrophic change. That comes directly from the collective memory of 536. Even today, when scientists study historical climate events and pandemic patterns, the year 536 serves as a crucial data point for understanding how multiple environmental and social crises can interact to create cascading civilizational breakdown. So let's take a moment to put this all in perspective, because I know some of you listening to this are probably thinking about your own bad years. Maybe 2020 with the pandemic, maybe 2008 with the financial crisis. Maybe that year in college when you failed chemistry and your boyfriend broke up with you and your car died all in the same month. We all have years that feel like the worst possible time to be alive. But my friends, let me tell you something that might make you feel better about literally any problem you've ever had. You have never, and I mean never, had a year that was even remotely close to 536 AD levels of terrible. Let's start with the basics. Right now, as you're listening to this, the sun is working properly. I don't know, obvious, but think about it. You have never once in your entire life had to worry about the sun just not working. You've never woken up and thought, I wonder if the sun will provide light and warmth today, or if it's going to look like a dim light bulb for another 12 months. Your biggest weather complaint is probably something like, it's raining and I forgot my umbrella. People in 536 were dealing with, it's snowing in July and all the crops are dead and we might resort to cannibalism. Slightly different scale of inconvenience. You think inflation is bad now? Imagine living in an economy where money is completely useless because there's literally nothing to buy. Where the phrase supply chain issues means there is no supply and there is no chain, and everyone involved in the supply chain is either dead or has fled to another country. You complain about grocery stores being out of your favorite cereal? They were dealing with grocery stores being imaginary concepts because food itself had become a theoretical idea. Your worst pandemic experience was probably having to wear masks and work from home for a while. Maybe you got sick and felt terrible for a week or two. People in 536 were dealing with a plague that killed almost half the population and had symptoms that included massive, painful swellings that turned black and leaked fluid. Plus, their version of working from home meant hiding in your house, hoping that everyone outside doesn't die and leave you completely alone in an abandoned wasteland. You think your commute is bad? They had to worry about whether their entire village would still exist when they got back from traveling. You stress about job security? They had to worry about whether their entire profession would still be relevant in a world where basic survival had become the only important skill. You think online dating is hard? Try finding a romantic partner when 40% of the population is dead. Everyone smells terrible because soap is a luxury item, and your idea of a fun first date is, want to help me bury these plague victims and then forage for edible roots? You complain about social media drama and political polarization? They were dealing with actual civil wars fought between starving people over the last scraps of moldy grain. Your biggest technology problem is when your Wi-Fi is slow or your phone battery dies. Their biggest technology problem was fire is hard to make and maintain, and without fire, we die. You get frustrated when your delivery food takes longer than expected. They were excited when they found food that had only been dead for a few days and probably wouldn't poison them. you worry about climate change affecting future generations. They were living through climate change that was actively trying to kill them right now, today, this minute. Your version of working from home during a crisis involves video calls and comfortable pajamas. Their version involved hiding indoors while hoping that the weird red rain outside wasn't actually blood, and that the strange voices they heard in the air weren't demons planning their demise. You think your student loans are a burden that will follow you forever? They were worried about whether the concept of forever was even going to continue existing, given that the sun appeared to be broken and the world seemed to be ending. So, the next time you're having a really bad day, when your coffee is cold and your boss is annoying and traffic is terrible and you can't find anything good to watch on Netflix, just remember that you are living in an era of absolutely unprecedented luxury and safety compared to your ancestors. You are not wondering if the sun will work tomorrow. You are not competing with your neighbors for the last edible plant within walking distance. You are not trying to figure out if those strange lights in the sky are angels, demons, or just your mind breaking down from stress. So what's the moral of this incredibly depressing bedtime story? What life lesson are we supposed to take away from the tale of humanity's worst year ever? Well, first of all, you should probably feel pretty grateful right now. Not in that annoying way where people say, "Think of the starving children," when you complain about minor inconveniences, but in a genuine perspective-shifting way that makes you realize how extraordinarily lucky you are to be alive right now, in this moment, in this century. You went to sleep tonight in a climate-controlled room. You probably had dinner. You definitely didn't have to worry about whether the sun would work tomorrow or whether plague-infected refugees might show up at your door. You're listening to this story on a device that would seem like pure magic to anyone who lived through 536 AD. You have access to clean water by turning a handle. You can communicate instantly with people on the other side of the planet. You can travel hundreds of miles in a few hours. You can preserve food for months without it rotting. You know what causes diseases and how to prevent them. You understand weather patterns and can predict them days in advance. Basically, you're living like an all-powerful wizard compared to people in 536. But here's the really wild part. Despite having access to miraculous technology and unprecedented comfort and safety, you probably spend a significant amount of time worrying about problems that would seem absolutely trivial to someone who survived the worst year in history. You stress about work deadlines while living in a world where work is voluntary and food is abundant. You worry about social interactions while living in a society where other people aren't competing with you for survival resources. You get anxious about the future while possessing knowledge and tools that make you infinitely more prepared for problems than any previous generation. I'm not saying your problems aren't real or that you shouldn't care about improving your life. But maybe, just maybe, we could all benefit from occasionally remembering that we're living in the most prosperous, safest, most comfortable period in human history. Your ancestors who survived 536 would probably be amazed that you have the luxury of worrying about anything other than immediate survival. They'd be fascinated that you have so much leisure time that you can spend it listening to stories about their terrible experiences. They'd be impressed that you've solved so many basic problems of human existence that you can focus on optimizing and perfecting your already pretty great life. The people who lived through 536 developed a fundamental appreciation for simple things: sunlight, food, safety, the absence of plague. They knew that these weren't guaranteed universal constants. They were precious, fragile gifts that could disappear without warning. Maybe we could learn something from that perspective. Not the trauma and desperation part, but the gratitude part. The recognition that ordinary life is actually extraordinary when you compare it to the alternatives. So tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable bed, in your safe home, with your functioning sun, and your working immune system, and your abundant food supply, maybe take a moment to appreciate how incredibly unlikely and wonderful your existence really is. You're living better than kings and emperors for most of human history. You have conveniences and opportunities and protections that previous generations couldn't even imagine. You're breathing clean air and drinking safe water and eating diverse foods and learning about the world from the comfort of your own room. You are the successful descendant of people who survived the absolute worst that the universe could throw at humanity. They endured freezing summers and plague pandemics and social collapse and literal red rain falling from the sky. They made impossible choices and lived through unthinkable hardships so that eventually, many generations later, you could exist in safety and comfort. Your very existence is proof that humans can survive absolutely anything. That civilization can recover from complete breakdown. That even when everything goes wrong simultaneously, people find ways to adapt and rebuild and create something better. The story of 536 AD isn't just about the worst year in history. It's about human resilience and the amazing fact that we're still here, still thriving, still finding ways to make life better despite everything the universe has tried to throw at us. And that's a pretty good thought to fall asleep to. But wait, before you get too comfortable thinking that 536 AD was definitely the worst year in human history, I have some news for you. There are other contenders for this terrible title. Other years that were so catastrophically awful that they make strong cases for being even worse than what we just talked about. And one of them happened so long ago that it almost ended human civilization before it really got started. I'm talking about the year 1177 BC. A year so devastating that historians call it the year civilization collapsed. Not just European civilization, not just one empire or one region. We're talking about the complete simultaneous breakdown of every major civilization in the known world. The Bronze Age had been humanity's first experiment with really sophisticated society. Complex trade networks spanning thousands of miles, advanced metallurgy, writing systems, massive cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants, international diplomacy between powerful kingdoms, art and literature and architecture that wouldn't be matched again for centuries. For over 500 years, the Bronze Age civilizations had been getting more advanced, more connected, more impressive. And then, in the span of just a few decades, around 1177 BC, almost all of it just disappeared. The Mycenaean Greeks, who had built the civilization that inspired Homer's epics, gone. The Hittite Empire, which had been one of the most powerful forces in the ancient world, vanished. The Assyrian Empire, reduced to a tiny rump state. Egyptian civilization, which had lasted for over 1,000 years, almost completely collapsed. Cyprus, which had been a major center of copper production and trade, abandoned. The sophisticated palace complexes that had been the centers of Bronze Age civilization were burned, destroyed, or simply left to crumble as people fled to who knows where. But here's what makes 1177 BC potentially worse than 536 AD. At least in 536, people knew what civilization looked like. They had memories and records of how things used to work. The survivors could rebuild based on previous models. In 1177 BC, civilization itself was still a relatively new experiment. When it collapsed, people didn't just lose their current way of life. They lost the knowledge of how to create complex societies. Writing systems were forgotten. Trade networks disappeared. Advanced technologies were lost. Entire populations seem to have simply vanished from the historical record, and nobody really knows what caused it. Unlike 536, where we can point to volcanic eruptions and understand the chain of events, 1177 BC remains a historical mystery. We know that something catastrophic happened. We can see the evidence in burned cities and abandoned settlements across the entire eastern Mediterranean. But we can only guess at what actually caused such widespread simultaneous collapse. Was it climate change? Invasions by mysterious sea peoples who appear in historical records and then disappear just as mysteriously? Economic collapse due to the failure of international trade systems? Internal rebellions and civil wars? Natural disasters? All of the above happening at once? The theories are wild and fascinating and slightly terrifying, because if we don't know what caused the Bronze Age collapse, how can we be sure it won't happen again? The idea that our current global civilization, with all its complexity and interconnectedness, might be just as vulnerable to rapid, complete breakdown as the Bronze Age civilizations were. That's a thought that keeps historians awake at night. But the stories from 1177 BC are even stranger than what happened in 536. We're talking about entire peoples migrating across vast distances and destroying everything in their path. Cities that had existed for centuries being abandoned so quickly that archaeologists find half-finished meals still sitting on tables. Empires that controlled vast territories simply disappearing from the historical record as if they had never existed. And perhaps most mysteriously, we're talking about the complete loss of literacy in some regions. People who had been reading and writing for generations suddenly forgot how to do both. Knowledge that had taken centuries to accumulate was lost in just a few decades. So if you enjoyed this journey through humanity's worst year, you might want to stick around for the story of humanity's worst century. The collapse that was so complete and so mysterious that some historians wonder if it was caused by something we still don't understand, something that could theoretically happen again. And so, we come to the end of our journey through 536 AD, the year when everything that could go wrong did go wrong. The year that makes any bad day you've ever had seem like a minor inconvenience. The year that proves beyond any doubt that humans are incredibly, almost impossibly resilient creatures. As you settle deeper into your comfortable bed tonight, in your safe room, in your peaceful time, I hope this story has given you some perspective on just how extraordinarily fortunate you are to be alive right now. Yes, the modern world has its problems. Yes, there are things to worry about and challenges to face. But you will never have to wonder if the sun will work tomorrow. You will never have to choose between starving and eating your neighbors. You will never have to flee your home because red rain is falling from the sky and you're convinced the world is ending. Those are problems that your ancestors solved for you by simply surviving long enough to pass their genes and their knowledge down to the next generation. Every single person listening to this story is the descendant of people who lived through terrible times and found ways to keep going. You exist because your ancestors were tough enough and smart enough and lucky enough to survive not just 536 AD, but countless other disasters, plagues, famines, wars, and catastrophes that have threatened human survival throughout history. That's actually pretty amazing when you think about it. You're not just randomly here. You're here because thousands of generations of humans before you refused to give up, even when giving up would have been the logical choice. Even when the sun disappeared and crops failed and society collapsed, they found ways to adapt and survive and rebuild. And that same resilience, that same adaptability, that same stubborn human refusal to accept defeat, that's all still inside you. You might never need to use it the way your ancestors did. You'll hopefully never face anything as extreme as global climate catastrophe or civilization-ending plagues. But it's good to know that if you ever do face serious challenges, you come from a long line of survivors who have proven that humans can get through absolutely anything. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep, you can rest easy, knowing that you're living in the safest, most comfortable, most prosperous time in human history. Your biggest problems are probably things that would seem like incredible luxury to someone who survived 536. Your worst day is probably better than the best day most people in history ever experienced. And that's not meant to minimize your struggles or make you feel guilty about wanting your life to be even better. It's just meant to remind you that you're already living an extraordinary life by historical standards. You have won the lottery of human existence just by being born when and where you were born. If you enjoyed this journey through the worst year in history, I'd love to take you on more trips through the strange, fascinating, terrible, and wonderful stories that make up human history. There are so many incredible tales of survival and resilience and human weirdness that most people have never heard. Stories that will make you laugh and gasp and shake your head in disbelief at what people have lived through. If you'd like to hear more of these bedtime stories from history, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any future adventures through time. Leave a comment and let me know what historical period or event you'd like to explore next. The collapse of the Bronze Age that I mentioned? The year 1348, when the Black Death arrived in Europe? The Mount Tambora eruption of 1815 that caused a year without summer? Or maybe something completely different that you've always been curious about? The amazing thing about history is that there are always more incredible stories to discover. More examples of human resilience in the face of impossible odds. More reminders that whatever challenges we face today, they're probably not as bad as what people have already survived. So sleep well tonight, knowing that you're warm and safe and comfortable. Dream peaceful dreams about your modern life with its functioning sun and abundant food and miracle technologies. And remember that you're part of an unbroken chain of survivors, stretching back through thousands of years of human history. You are here because people before you refused to give up, even during the worst year in human history. And that's a pretty wonderful thing to fall asleep thinking about. Sweet dreams.